The stagecoach lurched to a violent stop in front of the timber trading post, and when the door swung open, the woman who stumbled out looked like she had been dragged through hell itself. Her white wedding dress, once pristine and carefully stitched with delicate lace, was now torn at the hem and splattered with thick brown mud that climbed halfway up the skirt. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins and hung in tangled waves around her pale face, and her hands trembled as she gripped the door frame to steady herself. The other passengers stared, some with pity and others with barely concealed curiosity, but she kept her chin high despite the tears that had left clean tracks down her dirt-smudged cheeks. Clara Bentley had left St. Louis 3 weeks ago as a mail-order bride, full of hope and nervous excitement about meeting the man who had written her such lovely letters over the past 6 months. Thomas Whitmore had promised her a good life in the Montana Territory, a home of her own, and a fresh start far from the crowded streets and painful memories of her past. She had packed her few belongings, said goodbye to the orphanage where she had worked for the past 5 years, and boarded the train west with her heart full of dreams. The journey had been long and uncomfortable, but she had endured it all with patience, clutching Thomas's letters and imagining the moment they would finally meet. But Thomas Whitmore had not been waiting at the stage station in Helena as promised. Instead, a surly man with whiskey on his breath had informed her that Thomas had lost his ranch to gambling debts 2 months prior and had left town in the middle of the night to avoid his creditors. The man had laughed when he saw her wedding dress, making crude jokes about foolish women who trusted the words of strangers. Clara had felt the ground shift beneath her feet, her entire future crumbling in an instant. She had spent nearly all of her savings on the journey west, and now she was stranded in a rough frontier town with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. The stagecoach driver had taken pity on her and offered to bring her further north to Timber Ridge, a small settlement where he said there might be work for a woman with teaching skills. Clara had accepted because she had no other choice, climbing back into the coach with her ruined dreams and trying not to think about how hungry she was or how her feet ached in the tight wedding boots she had bought specially for her wedding day. Then, just an hour outside of Timber Ridge, the heavens had opened and rain had poured down in sheets, turning the rough mountain road into a river of mud. The coach had hit a deep rut and tilted dangerously, throwing Clara against the side wall. She had screamed as the door flew open and she tumbled out into the mud, landing hard on her hands and knees in the cold, thick muck. The driver had helped her back inside, apologizing profusely, but the damage was done. Her dress was ruined, her hands were scraped and bleeding, and mud had soaked through to her skin, leaving her shivering and miserable. She had cried then, finally letting the tears come as the weight of everything crashed down upon her. She was 22 years old, alone in the wilderness, covered in mud, and she had never felt more lost in her entire life. Now, standing in front of the trading post in Timber Ridge, Clara forced herself to take a deep breath and assess her surroundings. The settlement was smaller than she had expected, just a handful of rough wooden buildings clustered around a muddy main street. Mountains rose up on all sides, their peaks still covered with snow even though it was late May of 1876. The air was crisp and clean, scented with pine and the sharp smell of wood smoke from the chimneys. A few men stood outside the saloon, watching her with open interest, and she felt her cheeks burn with shame at her bedraggled appearance. "This is as far as I go, miss," the driver said, handing down her small trunk. "The trading post there belongs to Jack Morrow. He's a decent man, and he might know of work in town. Good luck to you." Before Clara could thank him properly, the driver had climbed back onto his seat and urged the horses forward, leaving her standing alone in the mud with her trunk at her feet. She looked down at her ruined dress and felt fresh tears threaten, but she blinked them back stubbornly. She had survived worse than this. She had survived losing her parents to fever when she was 10, had survived the harsh conditions of the orphanage, had survived the disappointment of 3 failed courtships back in St. Louis when the men had discovered she had no dowry to offer. She would survive this too. Clara bent to pick up her trunk, wincing at the weight, and began dragging it toward the trading post. Her boots squelched in the mud with every step, and she could feel the cold wetness seeping through the leather. She had made it halfway to the door when she heard the heavy tread of boots behind her and a deep voice that seemed to rumble up from somewhere deep in the earth. "Let me help you with that." She turned and found herself looking up at the largest man she had ever seen. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they blocked out the weak afternoon sun. His arms, bare beneath a rolled-up flannel shirt, were corded with muscle, and his hands looked strong enough to snap logs in half. He had dark hair that fell past his collar, slightly damp from the rain, and a thick beard that covered the lower half of his face. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a startling pale blue that seemed almost silver in the gray light, and they looked at her with a gentleness that was completely at odds with his massive frame. "I can manage," Clara said automatically, not wanting to be a burden to a stranger, but her voice came out weak and shaky, betraying her exhaustion. The man did not argue. He simply stepped forward, lifted her trunk as though it weighed nothing at all, and started walking toward the trading post. Clara followed, too tired to protest, and watched as he set the trunk down carefully on the covered porch where it would be protected from the mud. Then, to her complete shock, the mountain man knelt down in front of her. His massive frame folded with surprising grace, and he pulled a clean cloth from his pocket. Without saying a word, he reached for her right foot and began gently cleaning the mud from her boot. His movements were careful and methodical, wiping away the thick layers of dirt with a tenderness that made Clara's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "You don't have to do that," she whispered, feeling tears prick at her eyes again. No one had shown her such simple kindness in so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like. The man looked up at her, his pale eyes meeting hers, and Clara felt something shift in her chest. There was understanding in his gaze, as though he could see past the mud and the ruined dress to the fear and loneliness beneath. He did not speak, just gave a slight nod and continued his work, moving to her left boot and cleaning it with the same gentle care. When he finished, he stood and looked down at her, and Clara realized that she was staring. Up close, he was even more imposing, all hard muscle and rough edges, but there was nothing threatening in his manner. He held himself carefully, as though he was aware of his size and deliberately trying not to frighten her. "Thank you," Clara managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am Clara Bentley. I just arrived from St. Louis." "Nathaniel Stone," the man said, his deep voice quiet. "Most folks call me Nate. You look like you could use a hot meal and a place to sit down." "I don't have much money," Clara admitted, hating the words but needing to be honest. "I was supposed to marry a man in Helena, but he was gone when I arrived. The stage driver said there might be work here." Something flickered in Nate's eyes, an emotion Clara could not quite read, but he just nodded. "Come inside. Jack will find you something to eat, and we can talk about work after you have had a chance to rest." He picked up her trunk again and pushed open the door to the trading post, holding it for her. Clara stepped inside and was immediately enveloped in warmth and the scent of coffee and leather. The interior was dimly lit, with shelves lining the walls and displaying everything from canned goods to mining equipment. A pot-bellied stove glowed in the corner, radiating blessed heat, and Clara moved toward it instinctively, holding her cold hands out to warm them. A man emerged from the back room, wiping his hands on his apron. He was older than Nate, perhaps in his 50s, with gray streaking his brown hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. When he saw Clara in her muddy wedding dress, his expression softened with sympathy. "Good Lord, girl, what happened to you?" "This is Clara Bentley," Nate said before she could answer. "She needs food and a place to stay for a while. Can she use the room upstairs?" Jack studied Clara for a moment, then nodded. "Of course. The room is not much, but it is clean and warm. Let me get my wife. Sarah will help you out of those wet clothes before you catch your death of cold." He disappeared into the back, and Clara looked at Nate gratefully. "Thank you. I promise I will find a way to pay you back." "No need," Nate said simply. He set her trunk down near the stove and turned to leave. "Wait," Clara called out, not wanting him to go just yet. There was something about his quiet presence that made her feel safe for the first time since she had left St. Louis. "Will I see you again?" Nate paused at the door and looked back at her. The corner of his mouth lifted in what might have been the hint of a smile beneath his beard. "I come into town for supplies every few days. I expect we will cross paths again." Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, and Clara was left staring after him with her heart beating strangely fast in her chest. Sarah Morrow proved to be a plump, motherly woman who clucked over Clara like a hen with a lost chick. She helped Clara upstairs to a small but comfortable room above the trading post, then brought up hot water for washing and a simple dress of soft gray wool that she said Clara could borrow until her own clothes were cleaned and mended. "That dress might be beyond saving, dear," Sarah said gently as she helped Clara out of the muddy wedding gown. "But we will do our best. Now tell me, what is a sweet thing like you doing arriving in Timber Ridge looking like you have been through a war?" Clara told her the whole sorry tale as she washed the mud from her skin and changed into the borrowed dress. It felt good to speak the words aloud, to share the burden with someone who listened without judgment. Sarah made sympathetic noises in all the right places and declared Thomas Whitmore a scoundrel who deserved to have his ears boxed. "But you are safe now," Sarah said firmly, helping Clara brush the tangles from her hair. "Timber Ridge is a good town, a bit rough around the edges, but full of decent people. And if Nate Stone has taken an interest in your welfare, then you have nothing to worry about. That man has the biggest heart of anyone I have ever met, even if he does not say much." "Who is he?" Clara asked, unable to keep the curiosity from her voice. "He lives in the mountains?" "Up near Copper Creek, about 5 miles from here," Sarah confirmed. "He is a trapper mostly, and he does some guiding for hunters and prospectors. He built a cabin up there about 8 years ago when he first came to the territory. Keeps to himself for the most part, but he's always willing to help when someone needs it. Pulled my Jack out of a snowdrift 2 winters ago and probably saved his life." "He seems very kind," Clara said softly. Sarah gave her a knowing look. "He is a good man. Lonely, I think, though he would never admit it. A man like that needs a good woman to share his life with." Clara felt her cheeks warm and quickly changed the subject. "You mentioned work. I was a teacher's assistant back in St. Louis, and I can read and write well. I'm also skilled with a needle." "Well, that is fortunate," Sarah said. "We don't have a proper school here yet, but several families have been asking about tutoring for their children, and I can always use help with mending and sewing. The miners are hard on their clothes, and I take in work to make extra money. If you are willing, we could split the earnings." Relief flooded through Clara. "Yes, please. I would be grateful for any work you can give me." "Then it is settled," Sarah said, patting her shoulder. "Now come downstairs and have some food. You look half-starved, and I will not have anyone saying I let a guest go hungry under my roof." The meal was simple but delicious. Venison stew with potatoes and carrots, fresh bread with butter, and strong coffee that warmed Clara from the inside out. She ate slowly, savoring every bite, while Jack and Sarah told her about Timber Ridge and its residents. The town had been established 10 years ago when gold was discovered in the nearby streams, and though the easy gold was long gone, enough miners remained to keep the settlement alive. There was a saloon, a blacksmith, a small general store, and a church that held services every Sunday. The nearest larger town was Helena, a full day's ride to the south. "Most of the folks here are good people just trying to make an honest living," Jack said. "But we get our share of troublemakers too, especially on Saturday nights when the miners come down from their claims with money to spend. Best to stay inside after dark until you know your way around." Clara nodded, making mental notes of everything they told her. After the meal, exhaustion hit her like a physical blow, and Sarah insisted she go upstairs to rest. Clara climbed the narrow stairs to her borrowed room and collapsed onto the bed, too tired to even remove her boots. She was asleep within minutes, and for the first time in weeks, she slept without nightmares. She woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through the small window and the sound of voices drifting up from the trading post below. For a moment, she was disoriented, unsure of where she was, but then the memories of the previous day came flooding back. Clara sat up slowly, testing her sore muscles, and realized she felt more rested than she had in a long time. The borrowed dress was wrinkled from sleeping in it, but it was clean and comfortable, and she felt almost human again. After washing her face and attempting to tame her hair into a respectable bun, Clara made her way downstairs. Sarah was behind the counter, measuring out flour for a customer, and she greeted Clara with a warm smile. "There you are, dear. I hope you slept well. There's porridge and coffee on the stove, so help yourself." Clara ate a quick breakfast, and then spent the morning helping Sarah with various tasks around the trading post. She discovered that she enjoyed the work, finding satisfaction in organizing shelves and helping customers find what they needed. Several people asked about her presence, and Sarah quickly spread the word that Clara was available for tutoring and sewing work. By midday, 2 mothers had already approached Clara about teaching their children to read, and a miner had left a pile of torn shirts for mending. Clara felt hope beginning to bloom in her chest. Maybe she could make a life for herself here after all. She was folding a stack of blankets when the door opened, and Nate Stone walked in. Clara's heart gave an unexpected jump at the sight of him, and she found herself smoothing down her borrowed dress self-consciously. In the daylight streaming through the windows, she could see him more clearly than she had the previous evening. He was even more striking than she remembered, all hard planes and solid muscle, with those startling pale blue eyes that seemed to see right through her. Nate nodded to Sarah, and then his gaze found Clara. "Miss Bentley, you look better today." "I feel much better, thank you," Clara said, and realized it was true. "And please call me Clara." "Clara," he repeated, and she liked the way her name sounded in his deep voice. "I brought these down from my cabin, thought they might be useful." He set a stack of furs on the counter, beautiful pelts in various shades of brown and gray. Sarah examined them with an expert eye and quoted him a fair price. As she counted out his money, Nate glanced at Clara again. "I heard you were looking for teaching work." "Yes," Clara confirmed. "Sarah said several families might be interested in tutoring for their children." "I know of a few more," Nate said. "The families that live further out in the mountains. Their children cannot make it to town regularly, but they need education just as much as anyone else. I could take you around to meet them if you like. Introduce you properly." Clara's breath caught at the offer. It was generous and practical, and she knew it would help her establish herself in the community. But she also could not deny the flutter of excitement she felt at the prospect of spending more time with Nate. "I would appreciate that very much," she said. "When would be convenient for you?" "Tomorrow morning, if the weather holds," Nate said. "I will bring the wagon. Some of those families live a fair distance from town." "I will be ready," Clara promised. After Nate left, Sarah gave Clara another one of those knowing looks. "That man does not offer to help just anyone, you know. He must like you." "He's just being kind," Clara protested, but she could feel her cheeks warming again. "If you say so," Sarah said with a smile. "But mark my words, Nate Stone is not the kind of man to waste his time on things that do not matter to him. If he is making an effort, it is because he sees something worthwhile." Clara tried not to think too much about Sarah's words for the rest of the day, but they kept circling back through her mind. She found herself watching the door, half hoping Nate would return, but he did not appear again before evening fell. That night, as Clara lay in her borrowed bed listening to the wind whistle through the pines, she allowed herself to think about the mountain man with the gentle hands and quiet voice. She'd come west expecting to marry a stranger, to build a life with a man she knew only through letters. That dream had died in the mud outside Helena, and Clara had thought her heart was too bruised to hope for anything more than simple survival. But now, lying in the darkness with the memory of Nate's pale blue eyes filling her mind, she felt something stirring inside her that she was almost afraid to name. It was too soon, too impossible. She barely knew him. And yet, when he had knelt to clean her boots in that moment of silent compassion, something had shifted in her soul. She had felt seen in a way she had never experienced before, as though he understood her pain without needing words to explain it. Clara rolled onto her side and pulled the quilt up to her chin. Tomorrow she would see him again, and perhaps she would learn more about the mysterious man who lived alone in the mountains. For now, that was enough to hope for. True to his word, Nate arrived the next morning driving a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 strong horses. Clara was waiting on the porch of the trading post, wearing her own dress which Sarah had managed to clean and mend, though the hem still bore faint stains from the mud. She had also borrowed a warm shawl, as the morning air was crisp and cool. Nate climbed down from the wagon and gave her a nod of greeting. In the clear morning light, Clara noticed details she had missed before. The way his dark hair curled slightly at the ends, the small scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the calloused strength of his hands. He wore a simple outfit of dark trousers, a blue flannel shirt, and a leather vest, with a wide-brimmed hat to shade his eyes from the sun. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes," Clara said, gathering her skirts and accepting his hand as he helped her up onto the wagon seat. His grip was firm and steady, and she felt the calluses on his palm from years of hard work. Once she was settled, Nate climbed up beside her and took the reins. They rode in comfortable silence for the first few miles, following a rough track that wound up into the foothills. The forest closed in around them, tall pines that stretched toward the sky and filled the air with their sharp, clean scent. Birds called from the branches, and once Clara saw a deer bounding away through the underbrush. The beauty of it all took her breath away, so different from the crowded streets and smoke-filled air of St. Louis. "It is beautiful here," she said softly. "I have never seen mountains like this before." "They grow on you," Nate said, his eyes on the trail ahead. "When I first came to the territory, I thought it was the loneliest place on earth. Too much space, too much silence. But after a while, I realized that was exactly what I needed." "Where did you come from?" Clara asked, curious about his past. "Before you came to Montana, I mean." Nate was quiet for so long that Clara thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Missouri. I grew up on a farm outside of Independence. Joined the Army when the war broke out in '61. Fought for the Union until '65. Clara did the quick calculation in her head. The war had ended 11 years ago, which meant Nate must be in his early 30s. "Is that why you came out here, after the war?" "Partially," Nate admitted. "I saw things during the war that changed me, made it hard to be around people, hard to settle back into normal life. I tried for a few years, but it never felt right. So I headed west, looking for space to breathe and work that did not involve killing." There was pain in his voice, old and deep, and Clara felt a surge of sympathy for him. She'd read about the war in the newspapers, about the terrible battles and staggering losses. She could only imagine what horrors he had witnessed. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "War is a terrible thing." "It is," Nate agreed. "But it taught me some things too. Taught me to value peace, to appreciate silence and solitude. Out here in the mountains, I found a way to heal. It took time, but I got there eventually." They lapsed back into silence, but it was comfortable rather than awkward. Clara found herself relaxing, enjoying the rhythm of the wagon and the warmth of the sun on her face. She snuck glances at Nate when she thought he was not looking, admiring the strong line of his jaw beneath his beard and the capable way he handled the reins. After about an hour, they arrived at their first stop, a small homestead carved out of the forest, with a log cabin, a barn, and a few chickens scratching in the dirt. A woman emerged from the cabin when she heard the wagon approach, wiping her hands on her apron. 2 children peeked out from behind her skirts, their eyes wide with curiosity. "Morning, Martha," Nate called out as he pulled the wagon to a stop. "I brought someone to meet you. This is Clara Bentley. She's a teacher from St. Louis, and she's looking to tutor children." Martha's face lit up with interest. "A teacher? Oh, that's wonderful. Come in, come in. I will put coffee on." Over the next several hours, they visited 4 more homesteads scattered throughout the mountains. At each one, Nate introduced Clara and vouched for her qualifications, and at each one, the families welcomed her with enthusiasm. By the time they started back toward Timber Ridge, Clara had secured commitments from 5 families who wanted her to tutor their children, either at their homes or in town, depending on what worked best. "Thank you," Clara said to Nate as they drove through the late afternoon shadows. "I could never have done this without your help. These families trust you, and they were willing to trust me because you brought me to them." "They need a teacher," Nate said simply, "and you need work. It made sense to bring you together." But Clara suspected it was more than that. Sarah had been right. Nate did not strike her as someone who wasted effort on things that did not matter to him. The fact that he had taken the time to help her meant something, even if he would not say it aloud. As they rounded a bend in the trail, Nate suddenly pulled the horses to a halt. Clara looked at him in confusion, but he held up a hand for silence and pointed toward a clearing just ahead. Clara followed his gaze and gasped. A massive elk stood in the center of the clearing, its antlers spread wide like a crown. The animal was magnificent, all muscle and grace, and it lifted its head to scent the air, completely unaware of their presence. For a long moment, they all remained frozen. The elk, Clara, and Nate, suspended in perfect stillness. Then the elk turned and bounded away into the forest, disappearing as silently as it had appeared. "That was incredible," Clara breathed, her heart racing with excitement. "I've never seen anything like that before." "The mountains are full of wonders," Nate said, a hint of satisfaction in his voice, "if you know where to look." "Will you show me more?" The words were out before Clara could stop them, bold and eager. "I mean, if you have time." I would love to learn about this place. Nate looked at her, really looked at her, and Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks under the intensity of his gaze. Then he smiled, a slow, genuine smile that transformed his face and made her heart skip a beat. I would like that, he said. When they arrived back in Timber Ridge, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Nate helped Clara down from the wagon, his hands strong and sure on her waist, and she found herself reluctant to step away from him. "Thank you again," she said, looking up at him, "for everything. For helping me when I arrived, for taking me to meet those families, for sharing the beauty of this place with me. You have been kinder to me than anyone I have ever met." Nate's expression softened. "You remind me of something I thought I had forgotten," he said quietly. "What it feels like to want to protect someone, to care for someone. I've been alone for a long time, Clara. Maybe too long." Her breath caught at the raw honesty in his words. "I have been alone too," she whispered. "Even when I was surrounded by people in St. Louis, I felt alone. But I do not feel that way when I am with you." They stood there in the gathering twilight, the space between them charged with unspoken possibilities. Then, Nate reached out and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers brushing her cheek in a touch so tender it made her eyes sting with tears. "I should let you get inside before it gets full dark," he said, his voice rough. "But I will come by in a few days. Maybe we can take another ride." "I would like that very much," Clara said. She watched as he climbed back onto the wagon and drove away, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the darkening sky. Then she turned and went inside, her heart full of a feeling she had not experienced in so long she had almost forgotten its name: hope. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Clara threw herself into her new life with determination, teaching children during the day and helping Sarah with sewing and household tasks in the evening. The work was hard but satisfying, and she found joy in seeing her students' faces light up when they mastered a new skill. She also discovered that she had a natural talent for teaching, able to explain difficult concepts in ways that children could understand and remember. The families she worked with were warm and welcoming, often insisting she stay for meals and treating her like one of their own. Clara felt herself slowly relaxing into this new life, the pain and disappointment of her failed mail-order bride arrangement fading into the background. Timber Ridge was becoming home in a way St. Louis had never been, and she woke each morning with a sense of purpose she had not felt in years. But the highlight of each week was when Nate came to town for supplies. He always made a point of stopping by the trading post to see her, and sometimes he would invite her to take a walk or share a meal at the small restaurant that had opened next to the saloon. They talked for hours during these meetings, sharing stories about their pasts and their dreams for the future. Clara learned that Nate loved to read despite his solitary lifestyle, and he borrowed books from her eagerly. In turn, he taught her about tracking animals, identifying edible plants, and reading the weather signs in the mountains. With each conversation, Clara felt herself falling deeper under his spell. Nate was unlike any man she had ever known, quiet and reserved on the surface, but with depths of kindness and intelligence that revealed themselves slowly. He listened when she spoke, really listened, and he remembered small details about her life that she had mentioned only in passing. He made her feel valued and seen in a way that was intoxicating. She also noticed the way other people in town treated him with respect and affection. Nate might live alone in the mountains, but he was clearly an integral part of the community. He helped the blacksmith repair a broken wagon wheel, taught a young boy how to set traps properly, and sat with Jack Morrow on his porch in the evenings, sharing comfortable silence and the occasional story. Clara asked Sarah about him one evening as they sat together mending shirts by lamplight. "Nate seems very well liked in town," she observed, trying to keep her voice casual. "Has he always been alone? No family?" "His parents died while he was away at war," Sarah said. "And he had a younger sister, but she married and moved to California with her husband before Nate came out here. I think he gets letters from her sometimes, but I do not know if they are close. As for romantic attachments, there was a woman a few years back, a widow who ran a boarding house in Helena. They seemed to be courting for a while, but it did not work out. I think she wanted him to give up his cabin and move to town permanently, and Nate could not do it. The mountains are part of who he is now." Clara absorbed this information, feeling a mixture of relief that Nate was unattached and concern about what Sarah had said. Could she live in the mountains permanently, far from town and civilization? She honestly did not know. But when she thought about Nate's smile, the gentleness in his pale eyes, and the way he made her feel safe and cherished, she found herself willing to consider possibilities she had never imagined before. One Saturday in late June, Nate surprised her by arriving at the trading post with a basket of wild strawberries he had picked in the high meadows. "They are only ripe for a few weeks each year," he explained, holding out the basket. "I thought you might enjoy them." Clara accepted the gift with delight, marveling at the tiny, perfect berries. "They are beautiful. Will you stay and help me eat them?" "I was hoping you might take a ride with me instead," Nate said. "There is a place I want to show you, up near my cabin, if you are free, that is." Clara's heart leaped. In all the time she had known Nate, he had never invited her to see his home. This felt significant, like he was opening a door to a deeper level of trust and intimacy. "Let me tell Sarah where I am going," she said quickly. Sarah gave her blessing with a knowing smile, and Clara changed into her riding dress, a practical garment Sarah had helped her make from sturdy brown fabric. Then she and Nate set off in the wagon, following the now familiar trail up into the mountains. The journey took over an hour, climbing steadily through thick forest and across rushing streams swollen with snowmelt. The higher they climbed, the cooler the air became, and Clara was grateful for the warm shawl she had brought. Finally, they emerged into a high mountain valley, and Clara caught her breath at the sight before her. A meadow spread out like a green carpet, dotted with wildflowers in every color imaginable: purple lupin, yellow buttercups, white daisies, and red Indian paintbrush. A crystal-clear creek wound through the center of the meadow, its water sparkling in the sunlight. And at the far end of the valley, nestled against the forest edge, stood a log cabin with a stone chimney and a wide porch. "Is that your home?" Clara asked, enchanted by the scene. "Yes," Nate confirmed. "I built it myself 8 years ago. It is not fancy, but it suits me." As they drew closer, Clara could see the care Nate had put into his home. The logs were neatly chinked, the roof looked solid and well-maintained, and someone had planted a small garden near the side of the cabin. A barn stood nearby, large enough for horses and storage, and a lean-to sheltered a pile of neatly stacked firewood. Nate helped Clara down from the wagon and led her inside. The interior of the cabin was simple but comfortable, with a large fireplace dominating one wall, a sturdy table and chairs, a bed covered with furs in one corner, and shelves lined with books and supplies. Everything was clean and well organized, and Clara felt immediately at ease in the space. It is wonderful," she said honestly. "I can see why you love it here." "I wanted you to see it," Nate said, and there was something vulnerable in his expression that made Clara's heart ache. "To understand why I live the way I do. This place, this valley, it is my sanctuary. But lately I've been thinking that maybe sanctuary is not the same thing as a home. Maybe a home needs more than one person to be complete." Clara's pulse quickened. "What are you saying, Nate?" He stepped closer, his pale eyes intense. "I am saying that since the day you arrived in Timber Ridge, covered in mud and looking like your world had ended, I have not been able to stop thinking about you. I am saying that for the first time in years, I find myself wanting more than solitude and peace. I want companionship. I want laughter and conversation. I want someone to share sunsets with and wake up next to. I want you, Clara." The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I want that too," she whispered. "I came west looking for a home and a partner, and I thought I had lost my chance when Thomas turned out to be a lie. But now I realize that maybe I needed to lose that false dream so I could find something real. You make me feel safe and valued and seen, Nate. When I am with you, I feel like I am finally where I am supposed to be." Nate reached out and cupped her face in his large, calloused hands. "May I kiss you?" "Yes," Clara breathed. He lowered his head slowly, giving her time to change her mind, but Clara had never been more certain of anything in her life. When his lips met hers, gentle and questioning, she felt warmth spread through her entire body. The kiss was sweet and tender, a promise rather than a demand, and when they finally pulled apart, Clara was smiling through her tears. "I have dreamed of that since the day you cleaned my boots," she admitted, laughing at herself. "Is that silly?" "Not silly at all," Nate assured her, pulling her close and wrapping his arms around her. Clara rested her head against his broad chest, hearing the steady thump of his heart beneath her ear. "I have dreamed of it too." They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the valley together. Nate showed her the creek where he caught trout, the grove of aspen trees that turned gold in the autumn, and the high ridge where he sometimes sat to watch the sun rise. He pointed out animal tracks and told her stories about the wildlife that lived in the valley, the elk that grazed in the meadow at dawn, the family of foxes that denned near the barn, the golden eagle that nested in a tall pine on the mountainside. Clara drank it all in, falling more in love with both the place and the man with each passing hour. When evening began to fall, Nate built a fire in the cabin's fireplace and made them a simple dinner of fried trout potatoes and the wild strawberries he had brought. They sat together on the porch as they ate, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. "I should take you back before it gets too late," Nate said reluctantly. "Jack and Sarah will worry." "I know," Clara sighed, "but I wish I could stay longer. It is so peaceful here." "You can come back any time," Nate said, taking her hand and threading his fingers through hers. "In fact, I hope you will come back often. I want you to feel like this place is yours too." The ride back to Timber Ridge was slower, both of them reluctant to end the day. When they finally arrived at the trading post, Nate walked Clara to the door and kissed her again, this time with more confidence and passion. Clara kissed him back, pouring all of her feelings into the embrace, and when they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. "I will see you in a few days," Nate promised. "Sleep well, Clara." "You too," she whispered, watching as he drove away into the night. The summer passed in a golden haze of happiness. Clara continued her teaching and sewing work, but now every free moment was spent with Nate. They took long rides through the mountains, exploring new valleys and hidden waterfalls. They picked berries together and fished in the streams. They read books aloud to each other on lazy Sunday afternoons and talked about everything and nothing. Clara also began spending more time at Nate's cabin, helping him with various tasks and learning the rhythms of mountain life. She discovered that she loved the physical work, tending the garden, preserving food for winter, repairing tools and equipment. There was something deeply satisfying about working with her hands and seeing tangible results from her efforts. The people of Timber Ridge noticed the growing romance between Clara and Nate, and they approved wholeheartedly. Sarah was particularly pleased, often remarking that she had known from the beginning that the two of them were meant for each other. Even Jack, normally reserved with his opinions, said that he had never seen Nate look so happy and content. In early August, Nate invited Clara to accompany him on a 3-day trip into the high country. He wanted to check some of his trap lines and scout locations for the fall hunting season, and he thought Clara might enjoy seeing more of the wilderness. She agreed eagerly, and they set out on horseback, with a pack mule carrying their supplies. Those 3 days became some of the most magical of Clara's life. They camped under the stars, sleeping in bedrolls near a crackling fire. Nate taught her how to cook over an open flame and how to read the signs of weather changing in the mountains. They saw a herd of elk grazing in a high meadow, a mother bear with 2 cubs fishing in a stream, and a golden eagle soaring on the thermals above a rocky peak. On the second night, as they lay side by side in their bedrolls looking up at the vast expanse of stars, Nate reached over and took Clara's hand. "I love you," he said quietly. "I think I have loved you since the moment I saw you standing in the mud, trying so hard to be brave, even though your world had just fallen apart. You are the strongest, most resilient person I have ever met, Clara, and I cannot imagine my life without you anymore." Clara's eyes filled with happy tears. "I love you too, Nate. You gave me hope when I thought I had none left. You showed me beauty and peace and what it means to be truly cherished. I would be honored to spend my life with you." Nate propped himself up on one elbow and looked down at her, his face serious in the firelight. "I know I am not an easy man to love. I live a hard life in a harsh place, and there are days when I still struggle with the ghosts from my past. But I promise you, if you will have me, I will spend every day of the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me." "I could never regret it," Clara said fiercely. You are the best man I have ever known, Nate Stone. And yes, I will have you. I will marry you and build a life with you and grow old with you in these mountains. Nothing would make me happier." Nate leaned down and kissed her, deep and thorough, and Clara wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with all the love in her heart. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "We should wait until we get back to town to tell people," Nate said, stroking her hair gently. "Do this properly, with witnesses and celebration." "If you insist," Clara teased, "though I would marry you right here under the stars if I could." "Soon," Nate promised. "I want you to be my wife as soon as possible." They returned to Timber Ridge 3 days later, sun-bronzed and radiantly happy. The news of their engagement spread through the town like wildfire, and everyone seemed genuinely delighted. Sarah immediately began planning a celebration, enlisting the other women in town to help prepare food and decorations. Jack offered the use of the trading post's large back room for the ceremony and reception. The wedding was set for the last Saturday in August, giving Clara time to make herself a proper wedding dress. This time, instead of pristine white lace, she chose a practical dress of deep blue cotton that she could wear again for special occasions. Sarah helped her with the sewing, and the other women contributed lace for the collar and cuffs. Nate, for his part, seemed slightly overwhelmed by all the fuss, but endured it patiently. He had a new shirt made by the town seamstress and even trimmed his beard, though he refused to cut his hair short. Clara thought he looked perfect, exactly as he was. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and beautiful, with not a cloud in the sky. Clara woke early, her stomach fluttering with nervous excitement. Sarah helped her dress and arrange her hair, weaving wildflowers into the dark curls. "You look beautiful, dear," Sarah said, her eyes misty with emotion. "Nate is a lucky man." "I am the lucky one," Clara corrected gently. "He saved me in more ways than one." The ceremony was held in the afternoon, in the back room of the trading post that had been transformed with pine boughs and wildflowers. Every resident of Timber Ridge who could make it attended, crowding into the space and spilling out onto the porch. The traveling preacher who made a circuit through the mountain settlements happened to be in town, and he agreed to perform the ceremony. When Clara walked into the room on Jack's arm, he had offered to give her away since she had no family present, she saw only Nate. He stood at the front of the room looking impossibly handsome in his new shirt, his pale eyes locked on her face. The expression in those eyes made Clara's breath catch. Love, wonder, and a promise of forever. They spoke their vows in clear, steady voices, promising to love and cherish each other through all the days of their lives. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Nate pulled Clara into his arms and kissed her thoroughly, to the cheers and applause of everyone present. The celebration that followed was joyous and boisterous. There was music and dancing, abundant food and drink, and more well wishes than Clara could count. She danced with Nate, with Jack, with several of the miners and trappers who had become friends. But always, her eyes returned to her new husband, marveling that this strong, gentle man was now hers. As evening fell, Nate leaned down and whispered in her ear, "What do you say we slip away? I want to take my wife home." Clara nodded eagerly, and they made their farewells, thanking everyone for coming. Sarah hugged them both tightly, making Clara promise to visit often. Then, Nate helped Clara onto the wagon, and they drove away from Timber Ridge toward the mountain valley that was now their home. The journey took on a different quality now that Clara was traveling to her own cabin, not just visiting. She looked at the familiar landscape with new eyes, seeing it as a place she would learn to know in all its moods and seasons. When they finally arrived at the valley and she saw the cabin with lamplight glowing in the windows, Nate had arranged for a neighbor to come up and light them earlier. Clara felt a surge of pure happiness. Nate carried her over the threshold, another tradition he insisted on honoring, and set her down gently inside their home. Someone, probably the same neighbor who had lit the lamps, had also left a pot of stew warming by the fire and a bouquet of wildflowers on the table. "Welcome home, Mrs. Stone," Nate said softly, pulling Clara into his arms. "I like the sound of that," Clara murmured, reaching up to run her fingers through his hair. "Say it again." "Mrs. Stone," Nate repeated, kissing her forehead. "My wife. My Clara." That night, in the bed covered with furs, Nate showed Clara with gentle hands and tender words just how much he loved her. Clara had been nervous, having never been with a man before, but Nate was patient and careful, making sure she felt cherished and safe. When they finally came together, Clara felt a completeness she had never known before, as though all the scattered pieces of her life had finally found their proper places. Afterwards, they lay tangled together, Clara's head on Nate's broad chest and his arms wrapped protectively around her. "Are you happy?" he asked, his deep voice rumbling under her ear. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Clara answered honestly. "When I arrived in Timber Ridge covered in mud with my dreams in ruins, I never thought I would find this. But you were waiting for me, even if neither of us knew it. You cleaned my boots, and you cleaned my heart, Nate Stone." "You did the same for me," Nate said, tightening his hold on her. "I was so alone before you came. I did not even realize how lonely I was until I met you and discovered what it felt like to have someone to share my life with. You brought light and warmth back into my world, Clara." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, and when Clara woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through the cabin windows and her husband's sleeping face peaceful on the pillow beside her, she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The first year of their marriage was one of learning and adjustment. Clara had to adapt to the rhythms of mountain life, so different from anything she had known in St. Louis. There were challenges: the isolation, the harsh weather, the hard physical labor required to maintain the homestead. But there were also countless rewards: the stunning beauty of the landscape, the satisfaction of self-sufficiency, the deep peace that came from living close to nature. Nate was an excellent teacher, patient and thorough in showing Clara everything she needed to know. He taught her how to split wood, how to preserve meat and vegetables for winter, how to identify dangerous animals, and how to avoid them. He also taught her to shoot, insisting that she needed to be able to protect herself when he was away checking trap lines or guiding hunters. Clara, in turn, brought her own skills to their partnership. She established a proper garden that yielded an abundance of vegetables, herbs, and flowers. She made curtains for the windows and rugs for the floors, transforming the cabin from a utilitarian shelter into a warm, welcoming home. She also continued her teaching work, riding down to Timber Ridge twice a week to tutor the children who lived in town, while families from the outlying homesteads brought their children to the cabin for lessons. Nate built a small schoolroom onto the side of the cabin that first autumn, complete with a blackboard and shelves for books. Clara was touched beyond words by the gesture, understanding that it was his way of honoring her work and making sure she had a proper space for teaching. Winter came early and fierce that first year, blanketing the valley in deep snow and confining them to the cabin for weeks at a time. But Clara found that she did not mind the isolation as much as she had feared. With Nate beside her, she felt safe and content. They spent the long winter evenings reading aloud to each other, playing cards and talking about their dreams for the future. It was during one of those quiet winter nights as they sat together near the fire that Clara told Nate she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks but had waited to be certain before sharing the news. Nate's reaction was everything she could have hoped for. His face lit up with joy, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she were made of glass. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Clara asked, though she could see the answer in his eyes. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Nate said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have given me so much, Clara. A home, a purpose, a reason to look forward to each new day, and now a child. I never thought I would have a family of my own, and you have made it possible." Their son was born in late spring, delivered with the help of Sarah Morrow, who made the long journey up to the cabin to assist with the birth. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Clara thought she might not have the strength to continue. But Nate stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement, and eventually she heard the strong, healthy cry of her newborn son. They named him Daniel, after Nate's father, and from the moment Clara held him in her arms, she felt a love so fierce and protective it took her breath away. Nate was equally smitten, this huge, strong man reduced to tender awe by the tiny infant who had claimed his heart. Daniel thrived in the mountain valley, growing strong and healthy under his parents' devoted care. Nate proved to be a wonderful father, patient and gentle with his son, teaching him about the world with the same care he had shown Clara. When Daniel was old enough to walk, he followed his father everywhere, mimicking Nate's long strides and serious expression. Clara often found herself laughing at the sight of them together, her two favorite people in the world. 2 years after Daniel's birth, Clara gave birth to a daughter they named Lily, after the wildflowers that bloomed in their meadow each summer. Lily was smaller and more delicate than Daniel had been, with her father's pale blue eyes and her mother's dark hair. She was also more spirited, keeping her parents on their toes with her curiosity and fearless nature. The cabin grew more crowded with 2 children, so Nate spent that summer building an addition, creating a separate bedroom for the children and expanding the kitchen area. He also built a larger barn to accommodate the extra livestock they had acquired: more horses, a milk cow, chickens, and a pair of pigs. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Clara continued her teaching work, now with her own children as students alongside the others who came for lessons. Nate expanded his trapping and guiding business, earning enough to keep them comfortable and even allowing for a few luxuries. They made regular trips to Timber Ridge for supplies and socializing, and the town had grown enough to support a proper school, though many families still preferred to send their children to Clara for individual instruction. As the years passed, Clara watched her children grow and thrive. Daniel became his father's shadow, learning to hunt and trap and track with the skill of someone born to the mountains. Lily developed a love for plants and animals, spending hours in the garden or following Clara through the forest as she gathered herbs for cooking and medicine. When Daniel was 8 and Lily was 6, Clara gave birth to twin boys, Thomas and James. The pregnancy had been difficult, and the birth even more so, but both babies were healthy and strong. Nate had been terrified throughout the entire process, hovering anxiously and driving Sarah crazy with his constant questions and concerns. But when he held his twin sons for the first time, one in each massive arm, Clara saw tears streaming down his bearded cheeks. 4 children, he said in wonder. We have 4 beautiful children, Clara. We do, she agreed, exhausted but happy. Our family is complete. The twins were identical, both with their father's pale eyes and their mother's dark hair, and they were inseparable from birth. They did everything together, learning to walk, learning to talk, and later getting into mischief that would have been impossible for a single child to accomplish alone. Clara often said that having twins was like raising a small army, but she would not have changed it for the world. By the time the twins were 5, the cabin had undergone another expansion. Nate had built a proper second story, creating more bedrooms and a sitting room where the family could gather. The homestead now included a large garden, an extensive orchard that Nate had planted soon after their marriage, a smokehouse for preserving meat, and a root cellar for storing vegetables through the winter. Clara had also established a small lending library in the schoolroom, collecting books from traveling merchants and mail-order catalogs. Children from all over the area came to borrow books, and Clara delighted in fostering their love of reading and learning. One autumn evening, when Daniel was 14, Lily was 12, and the twins were 9, the family gathered on the porch after dinner to watch the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Clara sat in her rocking chair with Nate standing behind her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. The children were spread out on the porch steps and railing, content and relaxed after a day of work and play. "Tell us the story of how you and Papa met," Lily requested, as she often did. She never tired of hearing about her mother's arrival in Timber Ridge and her father's quiet act of kindness. Clara smiled and began the familiar tale. "I arrived on a stagecoach, covered in mud, and with my heart in pieces. I thought my life was over, that I had made a terrible mistake coming west. But then your father knelt down in front of me and cleaned my boots without saying a word, and in that moment, I felt hope for the first time in weeks." "And Papa knew right away that he loved you?" Thomas asked, his young face earnest. "Not right away," Nate admitted, his deep voice warm with amusement. "But I knew there was something special about your mother, something worth protecting and cherishing. It did not take long for me to realize I wanted to spend my life with her." "And now we are all here because Mama's first wedding did not happen," James said practically. "That man in Helena who disappeared did us all a favor." Everyone laughed at that, and Clara reached back to squeeze Nate's hand. "Your brother is right," she said. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us turn out to be blessings in disguise. I thought having my wedding plans fall apart was the end of the world, but it was actually the beginning of my real life. "Do you ever miss St. Louis, Mama?" Daniel asked. "The city and all the people?" Clara considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I miss certain things, museums, theaters, libraries, but I would not trade this life for anything. These mountains, this valley, your father, and all of you. This is where I belong. I have never been happier than I am right here." As if to emphasize her words, an elk bugled from the forest edge, the haunting sound echoing across the valley. The children fell silent, listening with the appreciation that came from growing up close to nature. Then Lily sighed contentedly and leaned against her father's leg. "I love it here too," she said softly. "I cannot imagine living anywhere else." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Nate began telling the children about the constellations and the stories behind them. Clara listened with half an ear, more focused on the feeling of contentment that filled her chest. She thought about the frightened, heartbroken young woman she had been 15 years ago, stepping off that stagecoach with no idea what her future held. If someone had told her then that she would end up married to a mountain man with 4 children and a thriving homestead, she would never have believed them. But life had a way of surprising you, of taking broken pieces and rearranging them into something more beautiful than you could have imagined. She had come west looking for a husband and a home, and she had found so much more: a true partner who loved and respected her, a community that embraced her, work that fulfilled her, and a family that brought her joy every single day. The following spring, when Clara was 40 years old and Nate was 48, they celebrated their 15th wedding anniversary. The children insisted on organizing a party, enlisting Sarah's help to plan a surprise gathering at the cabin. Friends and neighbors from Timber Ridge and the surrounding homesteads made the journey up to the valley, bringing food and gifts and filling the cabin with laughter and music. As Clara stood on the porch watching her children dance with Nate in the meadow, she felt someone come to stand beside her. It was Sarah, now gray-haired and moving a bit slower, but still as sharp and kind as ever. "You have built something wonderful here," Sarah said, gesturing to the scene before them. "A beautiful family, a thriving homestead, a legacy of education for the children of this area. You should be proud, Clara." "I am," Clara said, "but I could not have done any of it without Nate. He is the foundation everything else is built on." "He would say the same about you," Sarah pointed out. "You saved each other, I think. 2 broken people who found healing in love." Clara nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Sarah was right. She and Nate had both been damaged when they met, she by disappointment and loneliness, he by war and isolation. But together, they had created something whole and beautiful. As the sun set and the party continued, Nate came to find Clara. He held out his hand with a smile. "Dance with me, Mrs. Stone?" "Always," Clara said, taking his hand and letting him pull her into his arms. They swayed together to the music, comfortable and easy with each other after 15 years of marriage. Clara rested her head against Nate's chest, hearing the steady beat of his heart, and felt utterly at peace. "What are you thinking about?" Nate asked, his voice rumbling under her ear. "About how lucky I am," Clara said. "About how a single act of kindness changed the entire course of my life. You cleaned my boots, Nate, but you also cleaned away my fear and despair. You gave me hope when I needed it most." "You did the same for me," Nate said, pulling back slightly so he could look into her eyes. "I was just existing before you came, not really living. You taught me how to open my heart again, how to love and be loved. Every day with you is a gift, Clara." They kissed then, slow and sweet, while their children made exaggerated gagging noises, and their friends cheered. Clara laughed against Nate's lips, feeling young and carefree despite her 40 years. The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their children's lives. Daniel grew into a tall, strong young man who shared his father's quiet intensity and skill in the wilderness. At 20, he married Emma, the daughter of one of the families Clara had taught years ago, and built his own cabin in a neighboring valley. Clara's heart had ached a bit when he left, but she was proud of the man he had become, and happy that he was staying close to the land he loved. Lily proved to have inherited both her mother's teaching skills and her father's love of nature. She established herself as an expert in medicinal plants, traveling throughout the territory to teach other women about herbal remedies and healing. She remained unmarried, declaring that she was too busy with her work to worry about finding a husband, though Clara suspected there was a young doctor in Helena who might eventually change her mind. The twins, Thomas and James, were inseparable throughout their childhood and into young adulthood. At 18, they started a timber business together, using the skills Nate had taught them to selectively harvest trees from the mountain forests and sell the lumber to the growing towns in the territory. They were smart and hardworking, and their business thrived. As Clara approached her 50th birthday, she noticed that Nate was moving a bit slower than he used to, his joints stiff on cold mornings. He refused to admit that age was catching up with him, still insisting on doing all the heavy work around the homestead. Clara worried about him, but she also knew better than to try to stop him. The mountains and the physical work were part of who he was. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching yet another spectacular sunset, Clara voiced a thought that had been growing in her mind. "What do you think about writing down our story?" she asked, "for the grandchildren, and maybe for people we will never meet? I think there is something valuable in sharing how we found each other, how we built this life." Nate was quiet for a moment, considering. "I am not much of a writer," he said finally, "but if you want to do it, I will help however I can. It is a good story, after all. A story about second chances and the power of kindness." Clara smiled and took his hand. "It is a story about love," she corrected gently. "Love that started with a simple act of service and grew into something that transformed both our lives." She did write their story, spending the long winter evenings filling page after page with memories and emotions. Nate sat beside her as she wrote, sometimes offering details she had forgotten or correcting her on specific dates. The process of reliving their journey together was bittersweet, reminding them both of how far they had come and how precious their time together was. By the time Clara finished the manuscript, spring had returned to the valley. She had the pages bound by a bookmaker in Helena and presented the finished book to Nate on his 55th birthday. He held it carefully, his large hands gentle with the leather binding, and when he opened it and saw the dedication, "To Nathaniel Stone, who taught me that true love begins with an act of service and grows through a lifetime of partnership," his eyes grew suspiciously bright. "Thank you," he said gruffly. "This means more to me than you know." They gave copies of the book to each of their children, and Clara also donated a copy to the small library in Timber Ridge. She was surprised by the response it generated. People she barely knew stopped her in town to tell her how much the story had moved them, how it had given them hope or reminded them to appreciate their own partners. Several young women wrote to her asking for advice on finding love and building strong marriages. Clara had never intended to become any kind of authority on romance, but she found that she enjoyed sharing the lessons she and Nate had learned over the years. She began writing a regular column for the territorial newspaper, offering practical advice on marriage, family, and frontier life. The column became popular, and Clara discovered a talent for writing that she had never known she possessed. The years rolled on, bringing both joys and sorrows. Clara and Nate celebrated the birth of grandchildren. Daniel and Emma had 3 children, and eventually, Lily married her doctor and gave them 2 more grandchildren. The twins, Thomas and James, both married as well, and their families settled in the area. The valley and the surrounding mountains became home to a sprawling Stone clan, all connected by blood and love. But there were losses too. Jack Morrow passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, and Sarah followed him just 6 months later, her heart apparently unable to bear being separated from her husband of 45 years. Clara mourned them deeply, remembering how they had taken her in when she had nowhere else to go and had become the parents she had lost so young. Nate's health began to decline in his early 60s. The hard life he had lived was taking its toll, and though he still refused to slow down as much as Clara would have liked, he was no longer the invincible mountain man he had once been. Clara found herself worrying about him constantly, watching for signs of pain or exhaustion. On a crisp autumn day when Nate was 65 and Clara was 57, they took a long walk through their valley. The trees were ablaze with color, gold and red and orange against the deep green of the pines, and the air was sharp and clean. They walked slowly, hand in hand, stopping frequently to rest and appreciate the beauty around them. "Do you remember the first time I brought you here?" Nate asked as they stood in the meadow where wildflowers had once bloomed. Now it was covered in golden grasses that swayed in the breeze. "Of course I remember," Clara said. "It was the day you told me you loved me, the day I realized I loved you too. I knew then that I wanted to spend my life here with you." "And you have," Nate said, pulling her close. 32 years we have had together, Clara. 32 years of love and laughter and hard work and joy. If I died tomorrow, I would die a happy man." "Do not talk like that," Clara said sharply, fear clutching at her heart. "We have many more years ahead of us." But even as she spoke the words, she saw the truth in Nate's eyes. He was preparing himself for the end, making his peace with mortality. Clara wanted to rage against it, to demand more time, but she forced herself to be calm. If these were their last years together, she did not want to waste them being angry at the unfairness of life. "However much time we have left," she said instead, "I want to spend every moment of it loving you." "That sounds perfect to me," Nate said, and kissed her with all the tenderness of the young man who had once knelt to clean her boots. Nate lived for another 6 years, staying active and involved in his family's life until the very end. He taught his grandchildren to track and hunt, passed on his knowledge of the mountains to anyone who would listen, and continued to be Clara's partner in every sense of the word. His mind remained sharp even as his body grew frailer, and he faced the approach of death with the same quiet courage he had shown throughout his life. He died on a cold January morning when he was 71 years old, passing peacefully in his sleep with Clara beside him. She woke to find him still and quiet, his expression peaceful, and though her heart shattered with grief, she also felt a strange sense of gratitude. They had been given so much time together, so many years of love and partnership. Not everyone was that fortunate. The funeral was held in Timber Ridge, and the church was packed with people whose lives Nate had touched. There were miners he had guided to gold claims, families he had helped through harsh winters, children he had taught wilderness skills, and friends who had valued his quiet wisdom and steady presence. Clara sat in the front pew, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, and as she listened to person after person stand up to share stories about Nate, she felt a fierce pride in the man she had married. After the funeral, Clara returned to the cabin in the valley. Her children wanted her to come live with one of them in town, worried about her being alone so far from help, but Clara refused. This was her home, the place where she had loved and been loved for more than 3 decades. She could not abandon it now. She settled into a new rhythm, one that was quieter and more solitary, but not without purpose. She continued her writing, working on a second book about frontier life and the lessons she had learned from her years in the mountains. She also maintained the lending library and tutored a few students who made the journey up to see her. Her children and grandchildren visited regularly, filling the cabin with life and laughter, and Clara found that she was not as lonely as she had feared she would be. On the 2nd anniversary of Nate's death, Clara woke early and walked out to the meadow where they had shared so many important moments. The sun was just rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and the valley was absolutely silent, except for the whisper of wind through the pines. Clara stood there, breathing in the cold morning air, and spoke aloud to the man she still loved with all her heart. "I miss you every day," she said. "I miss your quiet strength, your gentle hands, your steady presence, but I am grateful for every moment we had together, Nate. You saved me when I was at my lowest point, and you gave me a life beyond anything I could have imagined. Thank you for choosing me, for loving me, for building this beautiful life with me." A bird called from somewhere in the forest, and Clara chose to believe it was Nate's way of answering her. She smiled through her tears and turned back toward the cabin, ready to face another day. Clara lived for another 15 years after Nate's death, remaining in the valley she loved until she was 78 years old. She continued writing, teaching, and being an active part of her large and loving family. She watched her grandchildren grow up and have children of their own, creating a 4th generation of the Stone family. She published 2 more books, both of which became popular across the Western Territories. On a warm summer evening, surrounded by her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, Clara passed away peacefully in her sleep in the same bed where she had slept beside Nate for so many years. She was laid to rest next to him in the small cemetery in Timber Ridge, beneath a headstone that read, Clara Stone, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, and teacher. She found love in the mountains and shared it with the world. Years later, when people talked about the early days of Timber Ridge and the families who had helped establish the community, they always mentioned the Stones. They told the story of how Clara had arrived muddied and torn, a failed mail-order bride with nothing but heartbreak and determination. They spoke of how Nathaniel Stone, the quiet mountain man, had knelt and cleaned her boots in a simple act of kindness that had changed both their lives forever. But more than that, they talked about the love that had grown from that moment, a love built on respect, partnership, and unwavering commitment. Clara and Nate had shown everyone around them what a true marriage looked like, how two people could support and strengthen each other through all of life's challenges and triumphs. Their descendants carried on their legacy, remaining in the mountains and maintaining the values Clara and Nate had instilled in them: hard work, kindness, respect for nature, and the importance of family. The cabin in the valley was preserved and eventually turned into a small museum where visitors could see how frontier families had lived and learn the story of the woman who arrived muddied and torn, and the man who showed her that love begins with service. And on quiet evenings, when the wind whispered through the pines and the elk bugled in the meadow, people swore they could feel the presence of Clara and Nate still watching over their valley, their love eternal and unchanging as the mountains themselves.